Welcome to Living Legacy Leadership, where we explore, discover, and share insights, tools, and strategies for a life well lived into elderhood. I'm your host, Donna Kim-Brand, author, speaker, legacy strategy coach, and creator of the concept Living Legacy, where you choose to live life on your own terms while contributing to people, places, and projects along your life journey. I believe that the life you live is the legacy you leave. Now, the guests I bring to you each week all address some unique aspect of learning, leadership, or legacy. This helps you raise your own game as a leader in business and life, and also showcases some extraordinary people who exemplify living legacy leadership. At least once a month, I also offer a training session to skill you in game changer thinking for your own application. So get your notebook ready or sharpen up your memory by tuning in your attention, and we'll dive right in. Well, folks, I hope you're happy to know that today you get me. And I'm going to talk about something that's crept up in my consciousness over this time, at the time of the recording of our COVID-19 pandemic. And that is about the varieties of nurturers and caregivers in the world, for better or worse. Now, not only in a pandemic, but in any situation of caregiving, you'll find that certain archetypes or patterns of behavior show up, both in their positive, along with the underbelly aspects. So I'm going to share 3 common types of nurturing personalities, along with how they seek and deliver care. Now, when you understand why they, or could be you, act as they or you do, both in virtuous and questionable behaviors, you can understand and deal with their service ethic more compassionately, and then look to minimize the downsides. So I was inspired looking through, I read and I look at a lot of different information. It's a virtue and a what shall I say, limiting factor of me that I'm so curious. And I go down lots of rabbit holes and study things and usually find the connection between them, which in fact we're going to talk about in a couple weeks to come when we're looking at how Leonardo learned and became such a genius. But anyway, back to this week's topic about archetypes of nurturers and caregivers. I was looking at the site of Carolyn Mace, somebody I've actually met in person. Her name is spelled M-Y-S-S, and her website is macemyss.com. She's very much into looking at what she calls sacred contracts, which are the spiritual contracts we make before we're born into this earthly life. And she was talking about the work of a woman named Stacy Couch, who herself was talking about these caregiver archetypes. And she mentioned 3 in particular that I'm going to share with you: mothering archetype, a companion archetype, and the servant caregiver archetype. Now, an archetype is really a pattern that shows up in mythology, but also in actual human life through and across history. And many people, particularly Joseph Campbell, was very big into writing about archetypes. But in terms of caregivers and nurturing, you're going to find that these 3 archetypes pop up certainly in personal relationships, your love life. So listen carefully so you can hear both the upsides and the downsides, and notice if any of these are playing out in your personal relationships. But they also are showing up strongly, which is what made me think of it in this time of pandemic. So just in a general sense, nurturers, of course, are people who love to give, TLC, and they pour their energy into giving, caring, and selflessness. It sounds great, right? Yeah, it usually is. But there's a downside. Along with each specific type we're going to talk about, these archetypes come along with some kind of what's called the dark or shadow side. So in general, before we get into the specifics of the 3 different types, in general, the downside or the shadow side of nurturers and caregivers are that, 1, they tend to neglect self-care. So they burn out. And then what happens is their caregivee, the person in their charge, whether it's their child or their spouse, lover, partner, or someone they're caring for in a more professional situation, is ending up being the brunt of their being exhausted, they're being irritated and crotchety, even curmudgeonly. So that's one of the downsides in general for caregivers. Another is they tend to be personality types that need to be needed. So even while the people in their care are very often trying to maintain their own independence, which I found actually when I was caregiving my mother on her decline or demise with Parkinson's over the years, she looked upon some of my efforts to caregive as harassment. When I took away the car keys, for example, when I didn't feel she was safe enough to keep driving for her own safety as well as anybody else on the road. Well, she didn't like that. Now, I wasn't trying to be needed in that case per se, but you get the gist, I think. So they need to be needed. And a third general downside or dark side or shadow side of caregivers are they tend to wander aimlessly without someone else's purpose to support. And then they struggle when their help is rejected. So if any of these things sound familiar with relationships you're having, and especially, as I said, in this time of pandemic where people have been thrust together and we're stuck together often in the same very small or certainly smaller than usual environment, and some people I know are even literally stuck in other countries or other situations because the borders closed or there are quarantine requirements or they got sick or someone around them got sick and they needed to be the caregiver or they needed caregiving. So, this environment of living in one place together, whether it's a home or where you were stuck, and over time, which is now extended into many months, and within all the uncertainty, not only the uncertainty of how long it's going to last, but even fundamentally what the heck we're really dealing with this virus. And beyond that, just conflicting views that you see on the media every single day. One side says this, the other side said that, and now it's this, and now it's that, something else. Darned if you do, darned if you don't. So it is very uncertain and confusing and conflicting times. And then you throw in working from home with raising kids, whether they be young kids or older or teenagers who are used to being more independent, then having to run homeschool for kids, dealing with isolations. There's so many different issues. Nonetheless, thrown into this situation of closeness, proximity to people, we have to become caregivers to a certain degree. It's a new need to look out not only for ourselves so we don't get ill, but also for others. Now, especially those considered at risk. So some of those, of course, are those with pre-existing conditions who may already be sick or healing or once had something that either compromised their immune system or could compromise their immune system. Of course, we're thinking particularly of elderly, and I know in the early months there was a lot of talk about protecting your grandparents or looking out for elderly neighbors, people stuck in nursing homes or assisted living or even hospitals. Or indeed, of course, people living on their own that are fending with all these issues by themselves. Then over the months, we've seen that some of the highest numbers of victims are not only people with pre-existing conditions of certain sorts, particularly respiratory types, but people of color. Blacks and Hispanics tend to have higher incidence of bad cases of COVID or deaths. Now, interestingly here, I am currently in the mountains of North Carolina, and I went to an art show that was outdoors last weekend, and I met a really interesting guy. He's Dr. Rutledge Ellis Benke, very, very swish name. He was in a booth selling a product he'd invented called Whiskey in a Week. You can look it up, whiskeyinaweek.com. And the cool thing, though, is that he's actually a professor of neurology at MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and we got talking about all kinds of things, including, common factors causing COVID and so on and so forth. And he said, and this is just a quick tip, that the common factor in bad cases or deaths appears to be a lack of vitamin D. So he does suggest that you take a supplement and also get yourself, if you can, at least 10 minutes of sun every day. Doesn't matter how cold it is, although you do better in warmer weather, but at least get some sunshine. And part of the reason why the darker skinned population is suffering more is simply because they don't absorb the vitamin D through their skin as readily as lighter skin. So it's as simple as that. And of course, all these things have been politicized. But back to archetypes of caregiving. One of the things I want to mention before I go on into mothering type is that Carolyn Mace, with her sacred contract concept, will also tell us that our own soul's journey is connected with our higher purpose and calling in this lifetime. And in the case of talking about caregiving and nurturers, this is their soul contract. This is why they're here, to experience this in this lifetime. And she calls it nurturing on purpose, or I call it nurturing as a purpose. So if we look at the mothering caregiver archetype, it's really interesting. Of course, mothering itself is considered a cosmic relationship. Obviously, it deals with birthing in the first instance, and then individuating as a child or whatever it is we've created is born and separates and is supposed to become an individual separate from the mother. But there are obvious historic issues with mothers and mothering, for better or worse. You know, we've heard the terms mommy dearest, oh my God, Oedipus complex, helicopter moms, the new term lawnmower mom. We'll talk about that in a minute. You know, and so mothers as an archetype themselves have been historically, and even in your own real life, idealized and also demonized. Now, mothers and the maternal instinct puts a mother into an eternal conflict. And the conflict is in relation to those she is nurturing, be it her child or a patient or someone you're professionally caregiving for. When is it's best for you to show up for them or to caregive for them and give nurturing, hold the space for them to do well, thrive, grow, all of those good and wonderful, juicy things we think about with nurturing mothering, and when to let go, to let that child or person be in charge of their own care, allow them the ups and downs, the trial and error, even failure that comes with experimenting and growing in, as an individuated human. And on top of that, the mother's got this eternal conflict of when to apply nurturing to herself, when she should give out for others, which often means to give up her own needs and wants, versus showing up for herself. So that's a dynamic that's always ongoing, and it's a really fascinating study. Of course, shows up in literature and philosophy and psychology and therapy beds, and even in everyday performance of how we think about who we are and so on. Now, the shadow side of mothering as a caregiver archetype has a couple of issues. Number one, there's what's referred to as the devouring mother, the mother who lays on the guilt, lays on the expectations. There's the term smothering, which, if you think about it, starts with an S and then says mothering. So smothering, that's the kind of stifling mothering under the devouring shadow side. There's the overbearing mother. There's the helicopter mother, which is the overseeing mother and always sort of hovering over and orchestrating and trying to coordinate and dictate and so on. And that was considered very much the mothering style of the last couple of decades, which has now morphed into what's referred to as the lawnmower mother.